see China as a great opportunity because China's come and invested. China is building a lot of infrastructure in Africa. China is buying up what Africa has to offer. But because many African countries don't have the value-added facilities, like for example, they produce these raw commodities, but then the investors come, they're exported. A lot of the value that's generated by these commodities doesn't really go to Africa, goes to the buyers, to the investors. So the question is this sustainable? And can China be in Africa while continuing to have, and I think Chris Burke talked about this, continue to have a foreign policy that is almost perceived to be value neutral. In other words, we're just there as a mercantilist. We're just coming there to buy things. We want to have a good economic relationship. We're not imposing any of our values. We have no value judgment when it comes to our foreign policy. And in contrast to the United States, which often will come in, or the European Union, and say, we'll deal with you, we'll trade with you, but you need to have fair trade, you need to have democracy, you need to have these, the laundry list of things they need to do, human rights. China won't do that. India, on the other hand, is an interesting possible middle, because India stands for, if there's any country in this world, stands for the triumph of democratic values against great adversity. I mean, there is a great sense of the value of democracy and human rights in India, despite whatever problems they might have in terms of poverty, in terms of ethnic divides and all sorts of things. So, there are many commentators who look on India as being potentially a more powerful foreign policy player in the world because it has that kind of values, has those kinds of values behind it. But they question how sustainable is China's foreign policy as it becomes it's forced to become a responsible stakeholder if it doesn't actually stand for any particular values when it deals with other nations, right? It says, we're just coming as friends to do business. We want to be, which is perfectly fine. But how sustainable is that? That's a good question, especially when it comes to sort of the test cases that we've seen in the Sudan, in Zimbabwe, in Myanmar. And China has strong relationships with a number of these countries. Iran, where the international community is saying, okay, China, you have these strong relationships with these countries. Now, help us influence them. And can you do something about them to make sure that they become responsible members of the international community? So, one question that many people ask, and Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist of note, I won't tell you my Tom Friedman in the back of a van story. I encountered Tom Friedman once in the back of a van. You don't want to. You don't want to be around. Yeah. No, it was because he was being hunted by anti-globalization demonstrators, and so he ducked into the van, in the back of the van, and I happened to be there. And so I had him as a captive. I could have thrown him out and fed him to the wolves. And I did that. Anyway, he said, if China calls for sanctions against Iran, it would no longer be a free rider or freeloader and could become a guardian in the post-Cold War world. This is about the exercise of power. At the end of the day, Iran will be a nuclear power or not a nuclear power, and there is no sitting on the sidelines saying it is none of our business. I welcome China as a global power, but this is nothing you can do by whispering. So basically, he brings out a point that is increasingly made by foreign policy commentators and analysts, particularly in the United States, saying that China has been a freeloader for far too long in the international scene, and given its increased influence, it should make its voice heard much louder, exercise its influence much more, and help us deal with issues such as Iran, such as Sudan. And North Korea, and indeed in North Korea, China has demonstrated it has played an important role. So this has become, again, I think in the next 10, 15 years, be one of the most important questions in international relations. To what extent does China exercise that power, right? And this is the current response that you'll get typically from the Chinese establishment. This is the president, the chairman of the Export-Import Bank, Chairman Li, who, basically in response to what Tom Friedman said, he said the Chinese philosophy is that the more you want to exercise your power, the less you will actually do so. We do not believe that outside forces can result in changes in the country. Only internally generated forces can. So, and he speaks both for China, saying that, you know, leave it to us. In other words, it's our internal matter how we exercise our power outside of China, because that's really a domestic issue for them. And this is what I was trying to say, that for the Chinese still, because they see their country as having many domestic problems that they have to deal with, it does affect their feelings about how much they can exercise power, their influence outside of China. So the feeling is that they have enough to do at home, and that that's the priority. Now, I may be presumptive. I see skeptical faces from my friend from the mainland. So I just want to preface this, but this is my own interpretation, and I may be completely way off. But I think Mr. Li has this, he's not just speaking about, you know, what's happening in Sudan or Darfur. That's Sudan's internal affair, we shouldn't interfere. That's one aspect. But he's also, in many ways, saying, you know, China, we're moving at our own pace. We will do things at our own pace when we feel we're ready. So that's why it's interesting when, recently, with the financial crisis, the statements from Chinese officials have been, look, what the most important thing we can do, Premier Wen said this, is the most important thing we can do to maintain stability in the global economy is for us to maintain strong growth. You know, we're sitting on $2 trillion in foreign reserve, but what we want to do is maintain our strong growth. We're not like, you know, they've introduced their stimulus package. They said they would contribute to efforts to monitor the international financial system. But, you know, China does a lot more than people think. China isn't just sort of sitting on the side, and I think this is very interesting. You know, that China is now as much of a player on the international sort of oversight of the international financial system, such as it is, than people imagine. But this remains kind of the view or the response that China has when people ask, well, shouldn't you be doing more? So, well, you know, at our own pace. The other question that many people ask, you know, I get questions if I go to, you know, international relations discussions or whatever about China. The question about the peaceful rise. You know, is this really a peaceful rise, right? Isn't China just sort of waiting to gain strength and suddenly spring out and say, you know, we're in charge now? And you know, it sounds fantastic to us, but believe it or not, there are people in the United States in particular, inside the Washington Beltway, who kind of believe that, this thought that somehow there's some perniciousness involved in China's growth, that down the road China will suddenly say, well, it's all over now, Washington, you know, we're in charge, we're going to start telling things, what to do, and yet.
I think that's a perfectly logical belief.
Yeah.
That's what pushed it, like, they like know best, so.
I think that that's true. In an odd sort of way.
It's like India, if they were at the top, and used to be like, so.
In an odd sort of way, it's kind of logical if you're, you know, sitting inside the Beltway and you're kind of like.
I think it's logical just based on history. Like everyone is.
Well, that's the question. That I want to ask based on history, though. I mean, when did China ever have hegemonic ambitions to go beyond its borders? And you know, particularly in recent modern history, tell me when, right? I mean, even if you look at Taiwan, just the situation of Taiwan, which in a nanosecond, China can take over if it wanted to, it has not, right? And do you think it could get away with it? Of course it could get away with it, because it's China. If China took over Taiwan tomorrow, okay, maybe it'll go in for a decade of being slapped in the wrist, but it'll probably, in many ways, get away with it. It will be able to do it without much, you know, and it could do it very quickly without much violence or damage. I honestly believe that. If you think that and if you think about